Hi there. This podcast was recorded in early 2023. With the acknowledgement that our world and current events shift every day, we hope you enjoy this slice of life from our community's voices.
The human story is the search for belonging. From childhood to adulthood, in joy and in struggle, we all sit in questions of how to make sense of it all. What is our place? Why are we here? What is our story of searching? Join us in conversation with community members, each sharing some of their own story. I am Ben Spratt, and this is Belonging. So it is an honor today to be in conversation with a dear friend and legendary leader of our synagogue. Jack Levitt is a past president of our congregation. There are many other titles that he holds. One of them is he's a proud mentor to generations of clergy, one of the people who is a primary mentor to our Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Robert Levine, and certainly to me, one of the people who's been a mentor in shaping my rabbinate and creating my own sense of belonging here. And Jack, it is truly a gift to be in conversation with you today, my friend.
Well, thanks. That's all very flattering and true in part.
Oh, you have to tell me what's not true then.
It's all true to a lesser degree than you indicate. But yeah, I have loved this place and I've been around it for a long, long time.
Well, with that, Jack, and I think as a person in my own life that has often sat with me and offered the reflective questions of wanting to know what is pressing on my mind and in my heart, I feel grateful to now be in a position to ask you a few questions. What has been your search for belonging? And if you're willing, over the arc of just a few years of your life here, of what has been that search? Where have you found it? And what does it mean to you today?
Wow. Well, since it's been a long, long life, it's also been a long, long search. Let's say, as a young person, as a kid, as a young adult, I resisted religion, being from a thoroughly Jewish family in every way and feeling thoroughly Jewish, so no shortage of that selfhood as a Jew. But in terms of religious interest or participation, resisted it and fought it for quite a long time, including of having a bar mitzvah or bar mitzvah preparation and being not at all a bad kid, but certainly an outspoken one. I made the point to my parents that they were being a bit hypocritical in insisting on my religious training and bar mitzvah because they showed no evidence of it. And I often say my father should have given me a good whack on the side of the head and said, "Good presentation, now off to Hebrew school." But he didn't do that. He was a little put off by me. So I never had a bar mitzvah until I was a dad and into my upper 40s or lower 50s of age.
So what inspired you at that point to decide that you wanted to celebrate that milestone, mark that kind of learning?
Well, for a guy who is sometimes accused or credited with fancy ways of expressing things, I will tell you what I said to Rabbi Hirschberg. I want to beat my kids to the bima. I felt that if I wanted them to have a religious education, which I very much did, I had to step up to the plate. And so into my middle years, because I got married late and we had our kids fairly late, I studied for and became a bar mitzvah. And I actually had a bar mitzvah celebration, which I urged not be a kind of funny version of a kid's bar mitzvah. So we did it in relatively quiet and sophisticated way. But I did have an actual bar mitzvah service here at Rodeph Sholom at the age of, in the neighborhood of 50.
Mm. And so becoming a parent made you reflective of the role of Judaism, wanting, it sounds like, for that sense of Jewishness to be passed on to your kids. But why? You know, if you grew up seeing hypocrisy as a child, pointing it out to your parents. What was it that planted that seed that made you feel like, you know what, this is something nonetheless I would like to pass on to my children? I assume maybe passing it on to your children in a different way than your parents passed it on to you.
For sure.
Do you remember where that came from?
I always had a strong feeling of being Jewish, of pride in that, of identification in every possible way with Jewish people and even Jewish history. I just knew. And I wanted them to be identified as Jews and to have some training and learning. And probably as important as those things, we heard there was a great preschool at Rodeph Sholom when my kids were 3 years old and 4 years old. And we signed them up. Membership was a requirement, as I recall. And that began a lifetime of participation and commitment and love of this place.
So if you think back to those years, do you remember at what point you woke up and realized, oh, this actually is now bringing something into my life? You know, that's no longer just about what's being bestowed to my kids, but it's actually affecting me.
I very much enjoyed Rabbi Gunther Hirschberg and got to know him. And as maybe we'll get to in this conversation, what it says about me, I'm not sure. But I became a rabbi guy. I became interested in rabbis, wanting to know more about them, learning about them and what moved them. And that became, in some ways, an important part of my life. And I've been good friends with many rabbis. And to have been someone that's available to them as well as they're being available to me. Later on in all of this long narrative, I became interested in what was going on at the Hebrew Union College, where almost all of our rabbis were trained, and became active down there, and therefore came to know a lot of rabbinic students. And I guess in a crazy way, I'm a little bit of a rabbi freak.
And as one of the people who's benefited from that, I'm sure I can say on behalf of everyone, thank you, Jack, because this is, yes, an organization, but sometimes we forget it was started by people who are wanting to feel a sense of belonging in the world. And I don't know that everyone knows that. I think sometimes we walk into services, we either like them or we don't. We like the melody or we don't. We like the sermon or we don't. We like the Hebrew school classes or we don't. But we don't always think about the people, the stories, the identities that led to those encounters. And I do think that that's something you've, at least since I've known you, always had your pulse on, is the humanness of it all. And I'm wondering if you could tell me what you see as the unique role rabbis play in America, in society. You know, you've obviously had exposure to lots of different kinds of leaders out in the world, you know, professionally in your personal life. But what is it about rabbis? What's the role that intrigues you most?
I faced the fact when I got interested, which was after I got interested in this synagogue and eventually at the Hebrew Union College, where I served on the Board of Overseers for a lot of years, and so was exposed to a whole lot of rabbis in the making and the process and the formula and the mixing of the stew. In our day, in this age, meaning the larger sense, not just these few years, but current 20th century and so forth, have an almost impossibly tough job to be what I would think would be good rabbis without abandoning, out of necessity, some important parts of what being a rabbi, to me, entails and requires. Because it's not an age in which the rabbi can depend on articles of faith.
So what are some of those qualities?
Compassion, real interest in people as individuals, differently interest in people as a community, two completely or almost completely different things, and an unwillingness, this may be the tougher part, to make rabbinical life and teaching just another expression of generous, liberal, attitudes, but to be something much more than that. They have to win their communities. At one of the recent events in the synagogue, I made the point that your story, in so many respects, at least to me, tracked the story of this synagogue. The place and you, Rabbi, sort of came to the same point at the same time, which was great for both of you and all of us.
Well, thank you, Jack. And I feel very blessed and feel grateful because I think in that, I think it captures some of the humanness that is a synagogue community. And thinking back to our first conversation together where you asked me mine, and in every conversation since, there's often an agenda that's set in advance. There are questions that are on your mind, questions that are on my mind. And it's interesting because no matter what topics come up, we ultimately come back to our life stories. And it has been one of the things that has taught me, I think, as a rabbi, of what it means to love a community and also love an individual, is to see where these two things intersect, the story of a larger community and the story of a person. So you've given us a tiny snapshot of how your story and the story of Rodeph Sholom intersected. I'd love to hear more of your story, and then maybe we can pull out some other details along the way.
All right, let me see if I can, since it's a long one, given my age, etc., let me see. I was neither a happy nor unhappy kid. I grew up in Washington Heights for the first 11 or 12 years of my life, and then down at 108th Street, then on 79th Street. So I often say, and it gives most people a kick, that the whole physical spectrum of my life was one straight line of about 5 miles from 176th Street to 62nd Street, which is where I live now. So I'm sort of a New York hick. I've never lived elsewhere for any period of time or been other than a tourist. West side of Manhattan has been my whole life. As I think I may already have mentioned, I'm not sure, when the time came, as I said, for my bar mitzvah preparation, I resisted it. I accused my parents of hypocrisy because they weren't shul goers. But they wisely said, well, okay, but you have to have some kind of alternative service, just like a draft dodger has to go through something. And so we agreed that I would go to a Yiddish shul, which is a school run by an organization which teaches Yiddish language, cultural heritage, and things of that kind, a little on the left-wing side, but in no way communistic or anything of that kind, because my father particularly would not have allowed for anything like that. And so I went to Yiddish shul, run by what was known as the Arbiter Ring, the workman's circle, which many of you or many of your parents or grandparents, you listeners, may have heard about or been part of. And so I went to a school which taught you how to read and write Yiddish. We put on little Yiddish plays and poem and recited poems. I'll tell a joke on myself. I could be sitting there with my mother and her friends yakking at the kitchen table, and I would talk up and, contribute some opinion or comment. And one of the women would say to my mother, "That boy has some mouth. He's going to be a lawyer." I apparently internalized that opinion and went ahead and did it. Not for any more elegant reason than that.
So, and over the arc of that career, did you find yourself gaining a sense of belonging through your work as a lawyer?
To some degree, yes, and to some degree, I always felt myself inside and outside of it. And it's always been true of me. I make decisions and make commitments, and a big part of me remains outside, viewing myself and trying to decide if it's really what I want to do. And there's always been some question about that. But with that, I was very much an active and committed lawyer, and by and large, with some exceptions and some very brilliant positive things, but both, I was a good and certainly a very interesting lawyer during my practice of all those years.
Well, it's heartening to know that even a person who gave himself with such dedication and, dare I say, success in his career, also had lingering questions, curiosities, wonderings of what might else have been.
Oh, yeah.
Because I do think, I myself, find myself at times wondering, if I hadn't become a rabbi, what would I have been? What would that have been like?
And
I could give you a whole laundry list of things, as I'm sure you could. Like, I'm curious, what were some of the things you pondered other than being a lawyer?
I think a scholar. Or, as a kid, a radio announcer, and use my powers of description to be a radio personality, especially in sports.
I love that. Well, and here you go. Now you get to be lifting that voice up. So, I think that ability to be able to be fully committed in a career and still raising curiosity. So, I was on track to being a biochemist, a genetic engineer. Mm-hmm. And there's still part of me that is that science geek and wondering, what would it be like to be in a laboratory right now? Even as I'm grateful to be exactly in the place that I am. And there's in the Talmud, in the collection of early rabbinic reflections, there's a great deal of obsession over the particular hours of the day, dawn and dusk, the in-between hours of the day. Mm-hmm. Full-blown daytime, full-blown nighttime, those early rabbis aren't so interested in, but they're obsessed over what do you make of the blurry middle margins of time. And I think about that in the Jewish mentality of what does it mean to be the person who can be both fully committed to a community, to a career, and also find himself mentally or emotionally wandering to the margins of it.
Yeah, what you were saying certainly resonates with me. I've always been both inside and also somewhat outside of everything I'm doing. So the notion of full commitment to this age and day, I may not know. Luckily for me and them, my partners in the law firm were much more down to earth and practical and money conscious than I was. And so fortunately for me, I could be a successful lawyer, but didn't need to do the things I wasn't good at because they kept the business going and made sure the dollars were in. And they kept me on my path when I sometimes wandered as well. So it was a lovely small law firm.
Beautiful. So I have to ask, Jack, growing up here on the west side, upper west side,
right?
Do you remember what it was like being here when World War II broke out?
I mean, I was a smart little apple. I was 10 or 12 or whatever the hell I was. And I read the newspapers every day at that age and followed the battles and was very keenly aware of what was going on, certainly in the European sector. And I had an older brother, a wonderful older brother who's dead now a long time, who was only 5 years older than me, but he was drafted. And he was in the Army, and he was sent over to Europe. And so his well-being and my parents' sleepless worry about him, because he was over there in the midst of things in the European sector, was the strongest recollection I have of the Second World War. My parents' profound concern for my big brother, who was in the 10th Armored Division over in Europe. And I was the kid brother and read all the battle things and worried with my parents when we didn't hear from him for a few weeks, and then we'd get about 10 of these letters and were reassured. So that's some of my recollection of that time.
Oh, I feel grateful then for all the people who gave, sacrifice, pushed in order to get us to where we are right now. So over the arc of your lifetime, Jack, you have seen on a local, on a national, on a global level, many different times where fracture, rupture, division, challenge has kind of erupted. And I'm curious, as we are here right now, what gives you hope?
Please forgive me. Very little. It springs eternal, but the spring is almost dry at the moment. Of course, I have hope, but I guess these days, Rabbi, and today particularly, this morning's headlines and all the rest of it, make it very, very tough for me, even the old guy who tries to see things in the bigger picture and all that, finds it very, very difficult to express much optimism.
So what do you think is the purpose of a synagogue like this in such a world, in such an environment?
Being there, being a place which invites, encourages, and teaches belief in good things and better things and generous things. A little more narrowly, a place for Jews to be Jews, comfortably, proudly, but not boastfully. And an environment for our kids, grandkids, to become and be Jews.
That certainly resonates for me, look, I think there are days where it's easier to access the light than others, but I do think one of the gifts in the Jewish psyche is this legacy that I do feel has been passed down from generation to generation of out of chapters of adversity has come a Jewish resilience, maybe, dare I even say, a relationship of responsibility, that even in the times when the well of hope feels like it's running dry, this persistent Jewish push towards believing, but nonetheless, we got to get up, we got to move forward. We have to believe that tomorrow could be better than today and give it everything we have. And I do think that there are very few places in our world today, very few beacons that offer that kind of message. And I hope that for my children, for my grandchildren.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think the synagogue, this one particularly, is a place to do those things. First of all, to be a home, a second home, and to be a place both of refuge as needed, and unfortunately there's a little of that, if not a lot, going on right now in the world and where we live, but also a place to identify and relate to everything that went before us and to be nourished by it, to be reassured and to learn. And I got to say, you're doing a great job.
Thank you so much, Jack. Well, I know that you will brush this off, but I really do mean this when I say, for me, part of what has made this community the place where I want to devote my life and my life's work is it's also the place where I feel like I've discovered the very best of humanity. It doesn't mean that it's always wonderful, and we're all human like myself, but I do feel like there's something that gets incubated here because of people like yourself that have been willing to sometimes seek refuge out of the storms outside, and at times be able to feel invigorated with that responsibility by stepping into these walls, but nonetheless to keep centering on people, on the story we inherit, on how that past can nourish us and inspire us to be shaping what comes next in the story. And so I know that there are many in this congregation that would offer this gratitude to you, but I want to offer gratitude for you being one of the people who reminds us of how we are a part of that story, how our personal story matters, and for all that you have given to make sure that more and more people can feel woven into that story. And my hope is that in people hearing your voice, it will inspire the next person who may have been dissatisfied, perhaps with their upbringing and religion, to imagine that maybe it's through the lens of their kids or their grandkids or just their neighbor that they could begin their own search for belonging and maybe, just maybe, turn this place into a next generation of a beacon of belonging for others.
Yeah, I mean, going back for a minute and accepting some of the, or reflecting some of the praise which you gave me, I think my presidency, a long, long, long time ago, of this place, and to some degree my predecessor, Janet Newberger, I don't want to exclude her because she too was a contributor to what I'm about to say, but let's say our presidencies transitioned the lay leadership from wonderful guys, and I say guys, who felt that their responsibility and their interest was almost exclusively on the practical side of the congregation, to a series of rabbis, starting with me or Janet and me, who loved this place as a place of religious life. And some, perhaps most or all, but certainly many of my successors as president have been wonderful Jews, as well as good practical leaders.
Beautiful, Jack. Well, thank you, my friend. This is such a gift. I feel like we should do this every week here. Okay. So many more questions I want to ask, but I want to offer thanks, and looking forward to many people getting to encounter your voice, your reflection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us and listening to this story of belonging. Stay connected with us on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me on Twitter at Ben H. Spratt. For more information about CRS, visit us online at rodeph sholom.org.